So this time we get to take a look at the second series of Lupin the Third, and it just happens to be Lupin the Third Part 2. Now last year I did the review for the first part, which was released in 1971, and I found that one to be pretty enjoyable for the most part. I mean, I did give it an 8 out of 10 after all, but still, I found it was a great start. So now we're taking a look at Part 2, and this one seems to be the one that most people have watched. One of the reasons is because this was the very first Lupin the Third series that happens to be in English. And also this was the very first series where Lupin, the character, actually had a red jacket instead of green. And usually they stick with a red jacket. And the difference between Part 2 and Part 1 is that this one is not nearly as serious as it was in the first part. Well, then again, even the first part wasn't like entirely serious, but of course this one is definitely a lot more campy. And this time around, for the story, it's still pretty much the same basic stuff. I mean, you have the character Lupin the Third, who is a master thief, Daisuke Jigen, the master marksman, Goemon 13, the samurai who can pretty much cut through anything, and lastly you have Fujiko Mine, who is a spy who always likes to try and take over the situation as much as possible, and usually likes to take the seductive route. And of course, how can I forget Inspector Zenigata, who is still obsessed with Lupin and trying to capture him, but of course he always ends up failing in the end. So this one does follow the same basic formula as the last one, where usually every episode is self-proclaimed, but they do make references from stuff that happened within the first series. Just for one example, in the first episode, the leader of the Scorpion Gang is back, but this time he has like some weird like green shield body over him. And they actually show the exact clips that came from that series with the racing. But the story does take place 5 years after the events of the first part. And because Lupin misses his buddies so much, they end up wanting to go have a reunion. And of course, you can take a guess what happens here. Shit hits the fan and they end up having to like do some epic shit and get out of it freely. So there's not a whole lot that I could say about the plot this time around because, well, it's pretty damn self-explanatory in each episode. But one thing I would like to mention that is kind of interesting, that I didn't even knew this until I looked it up, and that was Hayao Miyazaki, which I'm pretty sure anyone who is watching this knows who he is, actually worked on 2 episodes. In fact, after creating those 2 episodes, he ended up actually using some elements from them into such films that he's done, such as Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, Castle in the Sky, and Porco Rosso. So I find that to be pretty awesome. So like I said, there's not a whole lot I can explain about the plot this time around, but let's just move on and talk about the animation. And I must say, it's actually a lot more improved compared to the first one. Also, this was 6 years later after all, so you would at least expect it to look at least better, and well, indeed it does, so I really can't complain about it much. Now as for the music, it's actually pretty good too. It's very soothing with its jazz-like music, and it kinda has this James Bond feel to it, which actually does make sense, so it's actually good in that department. And as for the opening theme, they're pretty good. And they're very catchy, but of course I do personally prefer the main theme without like the vocals in it, but still, even with vocals in it, it still sounds pretty good. And another thing that is different between this one and the first part is that the main theme is completely different this time around, and this was the one that kinda stuck. Where in part 1, the opening, well, you don't really hear many people talk about that one. I mean, hell, I can't even find a single track of it on YouTube. But either way, the music and the openings are good. Now, as for the voice acting, now I'm going to be taking a look at the English one, and there's actually 2 English versions that you can watch. So there is the one by Steamline, and then there is the one by Pioneer. The one I watched was the one from Pioneer because that was the only one I was able to find. But according to a lot of people that have watched both the Steamline and the Pioneer, a lot of people tend to lean more towards the Pioneer one, so that's okay. Besides, it actually has a pretty good cast if I say so myself. So you got Tony Oliver as Lupin, which I think is definitely one of the best voices for him. It suits him perfectly. And then you got Richard Epcar playing Daisuke, which is also fucking amazing. Well, he is one of my favorite voice actors, and he happens to be playing one of my favorite characters in this show, so with that being said, I definitely think that's awesome. Also, I just love it the way how he says, "I'm getting too old for this crap." Which is an obvious reference to the Lethal Weapon movies with Danny Glover saying, "I'm getting too old for this shit." Now, of course, I can't make it sound as good as they do, but hey, you get the idea. It's definitely awesome when you hear it. And then you got Michelle Ruff playing Fujiko, which I also think is a very good role for her. So I really can't complain there. And then you got Lex Lang playing Goemon, Now I have to say, I do like Lex Lang as a voice actor, but I found in this role he didn't do the best job that I thought he would, at least compared to everyone else. He just seems to be a little bit off, but then again, it's at least amusing, but of course it's not like anything that's horrible sounding. But it's generally not bad, it's just, you know, compared to everyone else, it's just not as good. And then Dan Lorge is playing Zenigata, and I find he does a pretty good job with him. But I find he acts like a crazy cartoony version of Phil Hartman from A Full Metal Jacket. Lol, I just realized I said Phil Hartman. That was the guy who played the voice of Troy McClure from The Simpsons. But what I really meant was actually Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. But yeah, it is pretty damn amusing. And as for the rest of the cast, well, they're okay. I mean, usually it's just a bunch of like funky accents, but you know what? Whatever, it works. But overall, I'd have to say that the English voice acting is actually pretty damn good. So now, if I were to rate this one, I'd have to give it a 9 out of 10. Well, I think it's pretty obvious to say that this one is definitely a bigger improvement compared to the old one. Not only does it look a lot nicer, but I also find this show to be a lot more funny compared to the other one. Now, of course, when you have a show that is trying to be all, like, lighthearted and campy, that's usually what it tends to be, and well, in this case, I think it is definitely a hell lot of fun. In fact, this show is just generally really funny. So this one I actually did enjoy a lot more than I did the first part, but of course the first part it still remains to be a classic. And I can still recommend watching that one if you're very curious to see how it all started. But then when you watch part 2, oh man, it's definitely a blast. So there's not a whole lot else I could say other than that I actually really enjoyed this one. And as for next year's feature, there's a good chance that I'll probably do part 3. So until then, stay tuned.